Oceonaga. I'm Catherine Foreman Gray with Cherokee Nation Cultural Tourism. Thank you all for joining us for our August Lunch and Learn lecture series presentation today. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge District 2 Counselor Candace Teehee. If you would stand, thank you. Thank you for being here. So this next guy that I'm introducing, David Fowler, first time I met him about 20 years ago, he was decked out in a Civil War uniform, doing living history over at Fort Smith. And so he's a regional director with Oklahoma Historical Society. He's my guy whenever I am looking for information on Cherokee Nation, Indian Territory, and the Civil War. And so he's a regional director with Oklahoma Historical Society, and he also co-teaches the Cherokee Nation history course with me. So I'm excited for our presenter today. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to David Fowler.
Thank you, Catherine, for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be up here. I'm suffering from the glorious ragweed that we have floating around in Oklahoma, so I don't know how long this is going to last, but we'll do it as long as my voice holds out. So I hope you guys are taking care of your lunch part, and hopefully I'll take care of your learning part. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Civil War. I'll give a brief kind of overview, and then we're going to talk more along the lines of what happens after, and kind of some of the cause and effect of the war, and the changes that come about in Cherokee Nation. So, because this is kind of part of our history course that I so graciously get to teach with Catherine, that I'll kind of start where this actually picks up. So I'll kind of give an overview of the Civil War. So you can see up here you have a map of what Indian Territory, actually what Cherokee Nation looked like at the time that the war broke out. So after a long struggle with trying to keep Cherokee Nation neutral during the war, Chief John Ross finally signs a treaty with the Confederacy on October the 7th, 1861. So after that, two regiments were formed. The regiments were really divided up via party lines. So one regiment was made up of followers of Chief John Ross, the other of Stan Wadey. And after a couple of battles that happened in the winter of 1861, John Ross spends the remainder of 61 and 62 trying to convince the Confederate government that the Cherokee Nation was fully supporting the Confederacy, because some of John Drew's men in these battles defected or retreated back to Fort Gibson instead of participating in the battle. For the rest of 1862, the first half of the year, John Ross is still trying to smooth out relations between his government and the Confederate government. In 1862, there was a battle at Locust Grove. The rest of John Drew's men defected at that time. Most of these men were not really wholeheartedly into the Confederate cause. Their view was more along the lines of neutrality and the interest of what was best for Cherokee Nation. 1863, there were two major battles and a pivotal turning point for the Federal Army in Indian Territory. By this time, the Cherokees that had been under John Drew's regiment were taken into the Federal Army. They became the 3rd Indian Home Guard, so they participated at both of these battles. July 1st and 2nd was the Battle of Cabin Creek, which is up by present-day Pensacola. July the 17th was the Battle of Honey Springs, which is just south of Muskogee today, near the town of Renniesville. All right, and both of these were decisive federal victories. Of 1863, the Federal Army pretty much had control of Cherokee Nation in the northern part of Indian Territory. 1864, one of the last major engagements that happened was Stan Wadey and Richard Gannett had a Confederate victory at the second Battle of Cabin Creek, taking about 1.5 million supplies from the Federal Army to resupply their troops and to send needed food to refugees that were in Choctaw Nation in North Texas. So by the end of the war, we have a total of about 114 battles and skirmishes that occur within Indian Territory. So if you look up the other tallies on some of those, second and third are Virginia and Missouri for the amount of battles and skirmishes that happened. So Indian Territory saw a very lot of fighting. I think that truly that John Ross had his hand forced to sign the treaty. I believe that he wanted to remain neutral, and that it's just one thing after another that's leading him to have to to sign with the Confederacy in order to, first of all, to keep Cherokee Nation together, and second of all, really to protect the nation. Kansas is the closest federal, the closest Union state that has federal troops in it, and Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, all of the other nations, the other, 4 of the 5 nations have all signed with the Confederacy, and he's the last of the holdouts. So really, what kind of pushes his hand more to sign the treaty is the letter that Albert Pike writes to him. So Albert Pike was sent by the Confederacy to Indian Territory to get treaties signed between the tribes and the Confederacy. Pike had written back to John Ross to say that he's leaving the eastern part of Indian Territory, and he's going to head west. And that because John Ross says he wants to, the Cherokees want to remain neutral, that he expects them to do so, and that any infraction or any violence or anything towards anybody that supports the Confederacy, that he would bring all of the troops in Indian Territory that were signed with the Confederacy back to annihilate basically anybody who was took part of that. And what we have to remember at this time, the main factor in all of that is that Wadey has already been commissioned a colonel in the Confederate Army. So he had offered and they had commissioned him as a colonel in the Confederate Army, and he was to raise a regiment of 300. And if anything would happen between those old party factions, the Wadeys and the Rosses, that the Confederacy would come back on the side of Stan Wadey. So that was really the heaviness of what caused him to sign that treaty. And it carries on out throughout the war. That becomes one of the major points that John Ross stresses, is that the absence of federal soldiers in Indian Territory, because they had all been removed at the beginning of the war, was what really forced his hand. So on July 23rd, 1865, General Stan Wadey rode into Dokesville, Choctaw Nation, and surrendered all Confederate forces under his command. The American Civil War in Indian Territory was officially over. For the Cherokee people, the war had been devastating. An estimated 4,000 citizens lost their lives on the battlefields or to disease and starvation. 1/3 of all Cherokee women had become widowed. More than 1,200 children had become orphaned. Almost everyone had been rooted out of their homes, forced to live in refugee camps stretching from Kansas in the north to Texas in the south. Fort Gibson alone hosted some 7,000 refugees with loyalties on both sides. Economically, the nation was devastated. Farms and plantations laid in ruins. An estimated 300,000 head of livestock had been lost. Homes, mills, public buildings, and businesses had been destroyed or abandoned, and personal possessions for the comfort of daily life had long since been looted, making life in the camps for the refugees even more difficult. William Potter Ross wrote on the condition of the nation. Everything has been much changed by the destroying hand of war. Nearly all farms are grown up in briars and bushes, houses abandoned or burnt. Livestock of all kinds have become scarce, and we have not a horse, cow, or hog left that I know of. There is a great increase in the number of wild animals. The wolves howl dismally over the land, and the panther's scream is often heard. Older feuds between Ross and Wadey parties dating back to the removal had resurfaced, resulting in Cherokees serving in both the Confederate and Federal armies. By the war's end, Cherokee people were more fiercely divided than ever before. With peace came hope that these differences could be laid aside and the nation and its people could begin to rebuild. The first order of business to be addressed was the relationship with the federal government. So this also goes back to during the war that John Ross, when he was arrested or surrendered himself, he went back to Philadelphia, and from there he would request audiences with President Lincoln to plead the Cherokee side of this, is that we were forced to have to do this because of these reasons, and so he had finally gained access to Lincoln, and in the presence of Commissioner Dole, Lincoln had said that the relationship between the Cherokee and the federal government would go back to the status that it was prior to the war. Okay, because in 1862, the United States government had said all treaties with the tribes that had signed agreements with the Confederacy, any prior treaty was null and void. Okay, so but Lincoln admitted that in there that it would go back to the way it was before the war. So delegates from the 5 tribes met with the U.S. government officials at Fort Smith to establish a new treaty, which was very much of a shock to Chief John Ross, because after he had heard from Lincoln that relationships would go back to pre-war status, he left there and started working to ease the suffering of the Cherokee people that were still in Indian Territory, knowing full well that there was no more reason for him to ask for another audience. U.S. officials took advantage of a divided Cherokee Nation, and on July 27, 1866, a new treaty was ratified. The treaty stipulated that slavery was to be abolished, which is something that all the way back in 1862, whenever the Cherokee Nation was able to have its first national council since they had signed the treaty with the Confederacy, had emancipated their slaves. That so there was that was a stipulation in the treaty that had already been. Now, it didn't mean emancipation for those people who were fighting and those slaves that were owned by people who were fighting the Confederacy. All right, so there's a kind of a big difference there. It's kind of like the Emancipation Proclamation, so to speak. So the treaty stipulated that slavery would be abolished, land would be given up for the relocation of the tribes currently residing in Kansas. And there were also 2 other tracts of land that would be given up. The Cherokee Strip, which is a 2-mile strip across the top of the state of Oklahoma or the bottom of Kansas. And it was a surveyor's error which set the border 2 miles too far to the north. All right, and then the Cherokee Neutral Lands, which was the extreme southeastern corner of Kansas. All right, and the allowance for 2 railroad easements, one north and south, and one east and west. All right, so this will become the avenue that most encroachers will take, is within these railroad easements. So with the death of Chief John Ross in 1866, his nephew William Potter Ross was elected principal chief. Many who believe that, mostly the Confederates who had been a part of the Wadey party, they had believed that William Potter Ross was just another Ross that was put in place to keep them oppressed. A lot of them did not return back to Cherokee Nation and stayed in the Choctaw Nation. Some stayed in Arkansas, some stayed in Texas. So they didn't believe that this was a wholesale good move for them to have William Potter Ross as their chief. The divisions in the tribe would continue until the election of Lewis Downing as principal chief in 1867. Downing was born in 1823, Tennessee. He came to Indian Territory during the removal in the Bushy Head Detachment and served as an ordained minister at the Flint Baptist Church. During the war, he served in the pro-Union Cherokee Senate and was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the Indian Home Guards. And one of those pictures there on the right, you can see he's in his military uniform. Downing stated that unity as a people was of utmost importance to the nation. His actions were proof of his words, appointing both members of the Ross and Wadey Party to delegations and committees and having them work together. Although outside intruders and the lack of U.S. support to control its citizens, Cherokee Nation started making real progress in rebuilding under the Downing Party. Many Cherokees sought agriculture as a means to economic recovery. Most families worked small subsistence farms growing corn, raising hogs, and tending vegetable gardens. Others, like Clem Rogers, branched out into the cattle business. Rogers lost everything during the war. After he returned from the fighting, he rented a farm near Fort Gibson. With his first year's crop earnings and the money he saved working as a teamster, Rogers purchased a herd of Texas Longhorn cattle and began ranching on the Verdigris River. By 1875, his large herds were roaming more than 60,000 acres of the Cherokee domain. So one of the things that was nice about the recovery process, it made it easier about the recovery process, is that there were no taxes involved in Cherokee Nation. So people could use resources in the land, and they would not have to pay taxes on things like selling cattle abroad and all of that. So one you could petition the Cherokee government for kind of an exclusive use to an area and prove that you were using that, and it could be, and you could gain restricted, exclusive rights to graze in a particular area. Rogers was one of those. The Martin family did the same. And by the time that the allotment period approaches, these families were very well established in the cattle business. Businesses such as mills, stores, and blacksmith shops began to dot the landscape. Schools were also beginning to come back. In 1867, there were 32 schools in Cherokee Nation, and the male and female seminaries included in that. By 1870, 64 schools were being supported out of the annual annuity fund. So the annuity funds are money that was paid for Cherokee land back east by the federal government, and it was put into a trust fund, and they were paid annuities out of that. So a lot of times people get that really confused as this being some form of a handout from the government, when truly what it is that the federal government is managing money that is owed to Cherokee Nation. So it's kind of and not because Cherokee Nation could not manage that money themselves. That was just particularly the way that the federal government was going to play the game, okay? 4 years of war had destroyed the Cherokee family, had destroyed the Cherokee family structure. No longer were Cherokees able to rely on extended family or communities to care for parentless children. The Cherokee Nation set about establishing an orphanage. In 1872, the National Council purchased the home of Lewis Ross and established the first national orphanage, replacing the fostering system that had been in place since the end of the war. So after the war was over with, they had there were places that were, not technically orphanages, but there were places that children could go and live, and they could live with other families, but usually they weren't a family member. So, as we remember that, that this is an event that only happens, not within hardly another generation of the removal. The removal had an effect on the Cherokee population, by taking, by affecting the very, very young and the very, very old. Okay, so the Civil War didn't really necessarily discriminate on who it was going to take. All right, but what it did do was it took that fighting age of young man, and that was where they saw the most, the most loss of life. And then as that being, a provider in the household, and we know that Cherokee women were, they picked up the pace quite a bit. They took care of their families as the best they could during this war, and we have a lot of great stories and documentation that that Cherokee women laid it all on the line during this war, but they were forced to leave their homes in a place where they could garden and they could tend to their children, and that they could have livestock, and so they were forced to live in the squalor of the camps, and a lot of them suffered, and died from disease and starvation during this time. So the payment for all of this came from the sale of the Cherokee neutral lands and the Cherokee Strip. Okay, so don't get that confused with the outlet. All right, the Cherokee outlet is completely different than the Cherokee Strip. All right, so and then later on, a national asylum for the insane. They was also established out of funds of the sale from the neutral lands. So they used funding from the Strip to do the orphanage. They used funding from the sale of the neutral lands to fund the insane asylum. So these are two institutions that appear in Cherokee Nation that had never been there before. All right, so the stress of the war, PTSD, things of that nature that we know comes along with prolonged combat or trauma, and the need for that mental health services comes into effect, and then also the breakdown of the family and not being able to raise children as a community also is the need for things like the orphanage. And probably something else that factors in there that we don't really take into consideration all of the time is that there had been a change going over from the way that Cherokees had viewed. It had always been a clan system prior to that, and by the time the Civil War breaks out, you have a lot of families who are living more patrilineal with a man at the head of the household, more as you see Anglos living at this time, and that has an effect on that as well. So the war and that changing in the family structure, it really contributes to to having the need to have an organization like this, or an institution like this. Sorry. So also at this time, we have a group of folks living in Cherokee Nation. The Freemen, the former slaves of Cherokees, were also transitioning into a new post-war time of rebuilding. By stipulation, the Treaty of 1866, freedmen were to be adopted as citizens and with rights to land and resources. During the war years, some had fled to Kansas, where they would become part of the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment, which is one of the first regiments to serve in the American Civil War. That was the first regiment to fight in the American Civil War. And they fought at a place called Island Mounds, which was a week or so before the 54th Massachusetts won that honor of being the first black regiment to fight at Battery Wagner. Others had remained in bondage until emancipation after the end of war. These newcomers to freedom were also working to put their lives together in an uncertain world, a task that would bring them up clear to present day. All right? So In the post-war years in Indian Territory, the post-war years in Indian Territory were marked with progress and turmoil. Constant intrusion of non-Indian squatters on Cherokee land created problems over legal jurisdictions and laws. Also, the Treaty of 1866 had left open the possibility of consolidation of tribal governments into one or possibly statehood for Indian Territory. And this was the storm that would be to come. As Cherokees are trying to rebuild, have an influx of non-citizens that are starting to pour into Cherokee Nation. They're filling up those easements on the railroads, and so then they're also coming across the borders after committing crimes in Kansas, Arkansas, Missouri, Texas, places all above, and they knew that they could be that the tribal governments had no jurisdiction over them. So these outlaws and criminals were causing lots of problems for Cherokees in this rebuilding time. So there were men and resources, and that was why the Confederacy came. What complicated the situation was the removal of federal soldiers out of Indian Territory. So when you go back and you study the Confederacy had been building up for this war for a very long time. Okay, it was premeditated that it was going to happen. So any federal arsenal, facility, uniforms, soldiers, all of that stuff that resided within territory that would become Confederate states, they had a plan for taking that over, or had already taken it over. So they had weapons. They were ready to go. The Federal Army could not necessarily do that. Lincoln had to wait for the Confederacy to play the card before he could build up armies or do anything. I mean, simply resupplying food to Fort Sumter caused it to be fired on, starting the war. So the garrisons in Indian Territory were very small. There were 3 garrisons at the time. To begin with, 1824, Fort Gibson and Fort Towson are established, so they're 100 years old this year. All right, Fort Towson is closed, and Fort Washita is moved further to the west. So on the Washita River, Fort Washita is out in Chickasaw Nation. And then further up the river, they established 2 more posts, Fort Arbuckle and Fort Cobb. So Fort Cobb is clear out by kind of, out in kind of Caddo country today. So those, and they're very small garrisons. They're only maybe a company of men. They really don't have, hardly any artillery, anything to wage a battle against, a larger force. And so for their protection, they took anything of value that could be used against them, and they vacated those posts. Now, the problem was that in the, in both the Treaty of Holston and the Treaty of New Echota, all state that the United States government is there to serve as the protector of the tribes. And that was at the point when they crossed over into Kansas and left Indian Territory, free of federal soldiers. They had broken that treaty. And that was one of those things that John Ross continued to kind of go back, and go back and say that, you guys are the ones that left. But mainly it was the Confederacy coming to seek an alliance to stop anything that might come out of Kansas. Kansas at this time was very, motivated to fight against the Confederacy and slavery, and they saw Indian Territory as being one of those avenues that they could, the Federal Army could launch raids out of there. So they wanted buffer zones. They wanted, supplies, men, any resources that they could get out of this area. And then that's why they came courting. Yes, because once we, if you go and look at the officer corps that's fighting in Indian Territory in the Federal Army, every one of those guys were abolitionists. Every one of those guys knew John Brown. They fought with him. Phillips, Blunt, all of those guys, Bowles, everybody that's involved in the Federal Army at this time in Indian Territory had been at war in Kansas. So, I'm one of those firm believers that the war started in 1850 in Kansas and it ends, in 65 in Dokesville in Indian Territory. So, and the rest of everything that's going on, east of the river is all a sideshow. But they could have, the rest of the country should have been watching what was going on to Kansas to know what is getting ready to happen to them and in their neck of the woods. All right, thank you.